Hello, good afternoon, everybody. I'm Prabhu Chawla here from New Indian Express. We have a special session today, jointly organized by CII Express Group. The topic for discussion is Mission Atmanirbhar Bharat, mitigating the economic disruption caused by COVID. All of us are affected by COVID. We don't know when it's going to end and how it began, even that is a mystery. But to discuss the economic effect of this COVID, we have a very powerful panel here. They run the country, they run the corporate sector, they are the voices of millions of people and investors as well. Let me introduce them one by one. Dr. Kiran Mazumdar Shah. She is known as the Bio Queen of India. Everybody knows her. She speaks her mind, and I hope she will also speak here without fear and without favor. We have got R. Dinesh here at the moment, and he represents a very powerful sector. He is known as the king of supply chain, or you can call one book which was written about him, Sultan of Supply Chain. He is based in Chennai. He will talk about how the supply chain is disrupted here. That we'll talk about the subject, which is very important. After that, we have with us Dr. Noshad Forbes, India. He engineers the future. He has been engineering the past as well. He is well-known voice of the CII. He is speaking at various platforms. He will be here with us to share his perspective as well. After that, we have got Sanjiv Bajaj. Sanjiv Bajaj, of course, Bajaj family, everybody knows about him. I would rather call him the money maven or the colossus of commerce. He's very expert, he's known for that. And I hope he will give his short insight into how they manage money these days. Then we have got Puneet Chatwal. He runs, I would call the hospitable hero of hospitality. He has come here to the Taj group of hotels, has got 33,000 employees and 200 properties all over India. He will be giving the perspective how it is going to affect the hotel industry as well. Then we got Dr. Shankaracharya. I would rather call him Dr. Yes. I have dealt with him. He's the longest survival chief economic advisor in the government of India. Most of the problems or advantages we have got today, it is because of his policies or not. All of us, we can discuss that as well. Then we have got Shobna Kamineni. I would call her the Contessa of Cures. Her father created history in this country by first time starting the privatization of healthcare centers. So I don't want to talk much about her because she is the expert in the field, which we are going to discuss very prominently here today. Then I think we have introduced the panel. What is the subject all about? When we talk about mitigating economic disruption caused by COVID, I will just remind all of you, because you were listening to the Prime Minister when he spoke about what was happening in the country. His first sentence, which I'm quoting him correctly, that India needs Atmanirbhar Bharat, which will have 5 I's: intent, inclusion, investment, infrastructure, and innovation. But he said that, which was more important for all of you, India needs to manufacture products which are made in India, but made for the rest of the world. That is the emphasis, because in 2016, when he spoke about make in India, now he said made in India for the rest of the world. So this is a subject, because what's happening now, economy has gone down. Predictions about economy, I don't read it from -3% to -5%. How you are going to revive. There's the debate about demand and supply chain disruption. Various fundamentals of economic growth are being challenged. I have been a student of economics. I was in the Institute of Economics. And what are the economics I studied and I taught as a teacher of economics, those principles are not being applied anymore. Dr. Acharya is here. Among my teachers were Amritya Sen, Jagdish Bhagwati, and even Dr. Manmohan Singh. What we were taught at that time, there are various stages of economic growth in a society. But in India, across all those stages of growth, it went straight from a primitive economy of agriculture straight into services sector. 57% of services GDP comes from the services sector now. It's the only developed country which in 20 years span has got into services sector. But these are the questions which you have to raise while discussing what is happening in future. Whether all of us, because you are experts, you are running big companies, you have handled many crises in the past as well, and I'm sure you will be able to handle many more crises here as well. Let me go back to the first question. I'll start alphabetically or whatever name that have been given to me. When Prime Minister says, Atmanirbhar Bharat, when you're talking about mitigation, when he talks about Atmanirbhar Bharat, I'll ask, first of all, Shobhana, how do you interpret the Atmanirbhar Bharat in the present context? Shobhana, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Hi, thank you, Prabhu. I think that many great leaders have they really come into their own in the toughest of times, and I think this is where we all thought that Prime Minister Modi, his first term was transformational. Now he's faced the biggest challenge in the world, and he's taking one of the most populous countries. So they have to do something. Last evening, I read a lot. I refreshed my memory about FDR's New Deal, and saw how thoughtfully that he pulled the country out of the Great Depression. And one of the main precepts of that was that that industry was called in to partner with the government, and he called that the think tank. And while the Prime Minister has definitely had consultations with each industry group and industrialists, we do think that Atmanirbhar Bharat will happen only when private and public really come together. And with that, I'd like to pull into the healthcare space. We do know that this pandemic cannot be dealt with just the government healthcare facilities alone. But then the way that private is being targeted doesn't show that there's really this collective, because we're in this problem also every single day now. We face, how many beds, their friends of ours are sick, the waiting lists that are mounting up across wherever we have beds. So we understand the urgency, we understand the importance of needing to save lives. And we're right in the middle of this war. Things are going to spike, things are going to get worse. So if you look at today, if you look at the next 2 months, to me, I interpret it as a collaborative that we must fight together, to contain this. And then after that, and while we're containing it, I know that all my friends are going to think about how they're going to save businesses and get the economy back on. So I don't want to focus on that, because they will give you their perspective. Right now, the next 2 months, that's what this country is about today. We are all living from month to month. We're not even looking at what next June is going to look like, because we have to get through these 2 months. And I think that there are going to be many reiterations of the plan that the government has given, because that's the way it has to be. The money has to come in, there'll be changes, and unless we're agile, fleet-footed, and we're able to really build a trust bond, this is not going to work for us. So
yeah, Shobhana, I just want to take it a little forward with you, because there is some issue, because everything depends on how COVID you are going to handle and what is going to be its final reach, whether it is already peaked or not, because all your economic forecasts and all your economic prescriptions or your packages will work only if there's some kind of a definite idea about the impact of COVID. As a person who deals with pharmaceutical and your doctors running hospitals, what do you think? Because today WHO has given a warning, the worst is worsening. In that situation, all economic prescriptions will fail, because there's no vaccine for COVID anyway. So there's no vaccine for economic growth as well.
Let's not think about the cure, because again, like I told you, that's a June scenario. In the next 2 months, the good thing is that our arsenal has actually become stronger. So like the economy will find new weapons to fight, like I can see Puneet being here. He's opening his hotels with a whole new norm. And I think everyone has thought through that. It's the same with our treatment protocols. Every day, like I personally have reviewed 1,106 new medicine protocols, and I'm not even a doctor. And I think that many of these are out there. So it was fortunate for us that we locked down early, because now we have a lot more experience behind us. And even though they're repurposed drugs, they're combinations that will help us. Our young population will help us. So I think that that we will get over this. The next 2 months is going to be a hard fight, but it should be, economy is also not in play. We should open that, and I think that we'll struggle through these next 2 months, but we'll get over it.
I'll go to Dr. Nashad first, because he's expert in hearing and everything. He has been participating in all the debates. I just like to ask him, because the economic engine will move forward only when this package which the Prime Minister announced, 20 lakh crore, 21 lakh crore, somebody say 20 lakh crore, and once it was distributed among various sectors. I don't see why there is not a feel-good factor in the industry or anywhere else. 20 lakh crore Prime Minister announced was a big announcement. And I don't know why there is not a good feel factor. Do you all feel there's no good factor? There's a problem in conveying, communication gap, or the money is not enough?
So I think really the package that's been announced so far has been focused on many different areas. And the areas that matter to enterprises more broadly is MSMEs, where there's been very significant announcements, and where I think we're now starting to see an increase in bank lending because of the government guarantees. And so we'll see some impact there in the months going forward. And then second, in some things that have been done in the financial sector, in NBFCs in particular, and I'm sure Sanjiv can speak much more directly on that area. But there hasn't been anything so far for wider enterprises. So if you take your construction company, if you take companies that are in stress sectors, whether it's hotels or hospitality, whether it's hotels, whether it's travel and tourism, whether it's shopping malls, there hasn't been anything that's been made available for enterprises in general. And I think that's probably why you're not yet seeing a very strong, solid, welcome response to the package that's been announced so far. If I can add one more thing, I think the important thing is not just the short term. In the short term, as Shobna mentioned, we have huge uncertainty. And if we have huge uncertainty, what we need more than anything else is some transparency in how we will respond to how things unfold on the health side. So if we have some kind of a dashboard that tells us that if this kind of spread takes place here, this is the kind of response that we will need to have from a limitation of economic activity perspective. So I think that's the best we can hope for in the short term. But I think if we keep a focus on the medium and long term, I think that can more than anything else mitigate the economic disruption of COVID. If we can keep coming back and saying that, look, next year we will have a real bounce back. We will have a bounce back when we're beyond the health crisis, because of the fundamentals in the economy, because of the response from the government, because of how the private sector is responding as well. And in the long run, we will have a really better prospect. Why? Because we're addressing some issues now, fundamentally on the economic reform side, that will lead to a better and more dynamic and more competitive economy going forward. We've taken one step in the 20 lakh package, which is the points that have been addressed on agriculture. They're fundamental reforms and they're very welcome. We need to do the same thing when it comes to our external orientation and foreign trade. We need to do the same thing in the financial sector. We need to do the same thing in rebuilding the trust deficit that exists between the government and the private sector.
Dr. Nishad, you well put it. The question is why feel-good factor, because the 20 lakh crore rupees sometimes sounds like when the Prime Minister spoke, he said it's 10% for GDP. GDP at what was expected in the budget allocation. And the GDP might come down after COVID. That is what we expect. All of you are expecting that. So 20 lakh crore rupees when the budget comes down, and 20 lakh rupees the movement, if you go by fiscal provision, it is just only 1% of the total budget. With 1% of the total budget of the neighboring countries having 7%, 8%, 12%, how do you say, what you could have suggested to the government? Okay, do A, B, C, three things which you could have suggested, Dr. Folk, to the government. Be specific rather
Like in your own industry. We had three very clear recommendations from CII. Recommendation number one, something for the bottom of the pyramid in the way of direct benefit transfers that would be widespread and where we wouldn't worry so much about targeting, we would just worry about coverage. Item number two, income support, wage support for the enterprise sector at large. So whether you're talking about a construction company, whether you're talking about a small shop, whether you're talking about a manufacturing company, whether you're talking about a hospital, 3 months wages in the form of loans at 4 to 5% interest, using the banking system backstopped by a government guarantee. We said this would actually ensure that we protect employment, and by protecting employment, we set the foundation for a more rapid recovery. And that wouldn't be very costly because it's only government guarantees. The guarantees will only show, if at all, in next year's deficit or the year after's deficit, if the guarantees get called on. And third, right, address the actual sectors that are most affected. So address hospitality, address airlines, address shopping malls, address construction and real estate, because these are the sectors that have been that are the most affected and need the most help. Those are the bits that haven't been from that whole scenario. What we've seen so far in the 20 lakh crores is the MSME part, right? And a certain amount of different schemes for the bottom of the pyramid, not something that is widespread. So I'd say out of the 3 key recommendations that we had, we've done maybe 3/4 of one.
There's still a lot has to be done. You see what the kind of suggestions you made. I'll go back to Dr. Acharya because he has been the longest tenure as Chief Economic Advisor. Started during the regime and reforms in this country started. Shankar, I know that you, and my other thing is that I talk about all the time, that we always get the revolving door kind of a economic advisor. Out of the 20 economic advisors, most of them came from Washington or World Bank or IMF. I will not go, I'll have some discussion about him later. But Dr. Acharya, would you tell us, if you were the economic advisor now, would you have accepted the suggestion made by Dr. Foles here?
Well, I'm now about to become a colleague of his, so what else can I do?
Good.
But, no, I mean, let me say a few words, which I hope will complement what Naushad has said, and in essence, I agree with him. I think first of all, we really have to appreciate that the COVID and the lockdown it triggered, and has really been absolutely unprecedented blow to the Indian economy. We've had no other year in our sort of post-independence history where you've had this kind of hammering for the economy in all its respects. I mean, people are still very uncertain about just how much of a damage this will cause or has caused. If you notice that, 3-4 weeks ago, World Bank, IMF, government, investment banks, credit rating agencies were all still saying, oh, well, growth might be 1.5% positive. Now, in the intervening 3 weeks, it's all negative. Even the RBI said it's going to be negative. And some people, like me, think it might even be double digits. And even the State Bank of India says it's going to be -7%. So, we've just not had that kind of experience in our last 3 or 4 decades. So I just want to emphasize that. That's the negative side. On the positive side, I think what I'd like to emphasize is the cruelest month was April, to paraphrase T.S. Eliot, or rather, April was the cruelest month. And really, after that, as the beginnings of unlocking sort of started in May, and of course have gathered steam since then, it's really, we are now recovering. And I think the most powerful method of ensuring that output continues to rebound and employment also returns in a sense, to my mind, is just making sure that we have the courage and the determination to keep unlocking going forward. If we have any relapse, or if you like, backtracking on that, I think then we'll have far more serious problems than the very serious problems we already have. Even with this sort of unlocking, that's now very clearly in place. In fact, we're now supposed to be in unlock 1. The first quarter is going to be real write-off for most enterprises. And indeed, I think GDP alone, we probably, I mean, if you remember, Goldman has said that in the first quarter, GDP might decline 45%. CRISIL says 25%. I say, 25 to 30%. So, it's an enormous hit. But I think the recovery will be quite swift if we stick on the unlock path. I wouldn't be surprised if by the end of the year, our quarterly GDP is sort of within 5–6% of what it was at the end of last year. Now, that's still going to be negative. But as Naushad pointed out, next year is going to be a big rebound. It's pure arithmetic. Because we've had such a hammering in the first quarter of this year, and effects of it will show throughout the year, any element of positivity in the next year, even if our kind of the level is just about back to 2019-20 levels, in terms of GDP level, not growth, growth could easily be anywhere between 8 to 12%, depending on how big the decline was this year. If it was 7%, as the SBI says, growth next year could easily be 8%. If it's 10, 11, 12%, as I tend to think, growth could be 12, 13% next year. Now, I should qualify by saying that the real trick is to see what sort of growth we get after 21-22 is over. Because that's 21-22 is going to be the recovery year. It's the real challenge will come after that. And that's where, as Naushad mentioned, what we do in terms of a whole range of policies, in terms of reform, and you mentioned the external sector, the financial sector, and so forth, is going to be critical. I want to just emphasize before I stop that the manufacturing sector, to go back to what you said, Prabhu, that how come India seems to have gone straight from agriculture to services and sort of skipped manufacturing. I don't think that's viable for us. We really have to resurrect the manufacturing sector enormously. And I was very, very happy to hear the Prime Minister say that going forward, he repeated what he said a couple of years earlier, that we must make in India for the world. Because that to me gave me a lot of reassurance that the future, from a policy perspective, will have a stronger emphasis on making for the world, being competitive, export orientation, and so forth. Let me stop there.
Doctor, I think like a good economist, you have skirted the issue which I was trying to raise. You have been chief economic advisor, and Naushad put certain proposals there. They talked about DBT and giving concessional rate of interest, giving cash transfer to the poor people. And since you are a market economist, because you know all the economists who have been coming to India from 1991, you avoided the question. Why can't the government like Trump, like British Prime Minister, everybody has put cash money in the pockets of the manufacturer? Okay, 70% of your wages will meet. Trump is earning cash money. What do you think if you were the chief economic advisor to Mr. Modi? Would you have suggested that or not?
Yeah, I think the reason I emphasized, I first wanted to sort of emphasize the setting in which policy is being made, partly because of my sort of experience for many years in the policy circles. Because I think precisely because the first quarter has been so damaging to output and employment, it's also been hugely damaging to government revenues, central level as well as state levels. So there, I suspect, and I don't know what's going on inside the finance ministry now, but I suspect there's just very little money coming in. And so while government may in principle agree with a lot of what Naushad has said, I think the reason perhaps that they have chosen to emphasize, for example, what has been done for MSME, which is essentially a credit guarantee program, is that its call for government money right now is relatively little. they'll come home to roost later. Now,
Okay.
could that be done a little more for other sectors? Possibly, and quite possibly that will come. But in a sense, the real money, the cash money, as he suggested, should be really initially, in my view, focused on those who've been hurt the most, the poorest segments of our society who've lost jobs and income earnings. And there, I think the problem has been not just an issue of not enough money, that might have been part of it. I think our delivery mechanisms for, if you like, getting to targeted populations is not that finely honed. And making it universal, as Naushad had suggested, I think it probably ran into a sense of, look, we're not getting any money. If we make it universal, we'll have nothing. But I'm just speculating. I don't know what went on in the finance ministry and in the PMO.
I'll come back to Shankar, back to you again a little later. Let me go back to Sanjiv now, because he's a finance man here. Money knows what money means and how it is gone from one sector, one hand to another, B to C, C to B. Sanjiv, can you tell us what is your prescription in the current scenario where the money, everybody talking about money, but nobody talking in what manner, in which manner, because when it comes to deficit, that is a very sensitive subject to the corporate sector as well. They don't want deficit to go up, yet they want the money in the hands of the people. And there is no money in the hands of the government. And therefore, this deficit has become some kind of a sin word in this country, because when America or Japan goes for 18% of deficit, 220% borrowing of GDP, none of us talk about it. When USA takes so much of deficit, nobody talks about it. Biggest borrower in the world. No economist talks about those things. When it comes to India, you cross the 3.5%, BRICS start throwing on that. But that's a different subject. I'll come to that later. Why all of us are against deficit financing, which is basically, like my teacher, Dr. Sen said, it is good to have Keynesian theory. You go back to that. Whether I'll come back to that also, supply creates its own demand, which hasn't happened in case of India at all. But what do you think? What should be done in terms of getting money back into the hands of everybody, from bottom to top?
So Prabhuji, let me first say that Atmanirbhar Bharat to me means two things. It means in the short term, get our economy chugging again. And in the medium to long term, build self-reliance under what the Prime Minister has spelled out for us, and build a competitive India that can sell to the world across manufacturing and services. Not a protectionist India. Atmanirbhar to me is not protection. It is about building competitiveness with the government supporting private enterprise. But let's come to the first part of it, the immediate situation. What can we do to kickstart this economy? In my point of view, there are 4 pillars that we need to work on. First, we need to rebuild confidence. See, this 2 months of this tremendous health scare, not only in India, but all over the world, has created tremendous fear. We can see the virus is spreading, we can see there is mortality. But let us keep in mind also that we are a young country. Our mortality rate, for whatever reason, and there are different medical experts are giving many reasons, but the reality is that our mortality rate is far lower from this virus than many other countries. So we should continue to follow all the safety protocols that the experts are telling us. But we have to give confidence to people that you can carefully step out as long as you're not in the containment area, get back to work in a safe setting, practice safe distancing. Look at even how the media is promoting numbers. Instead of looking at absolute numbers, if you look at numbers of the active cases, of the deaths as a percentage of our population, we are not even in the top 100 countries in the world. So I think we need to take out this unnecessary fear, which I think is largely unintentional, but we have to overcome that. We also have to see that those at the lowest end of society who have lost their jobs, who are not getting salaries, as Naushad mentioned, if for a temporary period of time, if for 3 months, if for 6 months, we can take care of some of their household income, it will create tremendous amount of certainty for those people who are at the bottom of the pyramid. So the first thing to me is rebuild confidence. The next is that we have to restart our supply side. Supply chains have never seen this kind of disruption. They have to be rebuilt. They have to be rebuilt with the government participating with industry associations like CII and trying to understand how are you going to put the moving blocks together so that from a component person to a finished goods manufacturer to the seller, everything is working in unison. And because this kind of a disruption has never happened before, it will take some effort, but it requires a lot of concerted and coordinated effort to build this supply side. What the government and RBI has already done is they have made the arrangement of money on the supply side. And it's already been talked about, so I won't repeat that in detail right now, but what they've announced for MSMEs, and I also believe, like Naushad does, that a few more sectors that are hardest hit, they should make arrangement. See, keep in mind that when you require the stimulus, you hopefully don't require it for a long period of time. When you restart a car for the first time after a month, it requires effort for the first few seconds. Then the car picks up. I think that's where our economy is. If we can spend a few months of greater effort, of greater stimulus, after that, the wheels will start running on their own. So this is the second pillar on the supply side. Third, very important, is on the demand side. I think after you take care of some of the basic income for the people at the lowest end of the pyramid, if the government were to look at one or two stimulus on the demand side, for example, we know that for consumers, for individuals, the two big purchases from value perspective are homes and cars, two-wheelers, four-wheelers. If the government were to say that, you're buying a home on a 10-year, 12-year loan, first year, and this is loans only up to a particular value, so particular size of house, particular type, size of customer segment, 1 year interest we take care of. Let us calculate how much that comes to. Can we take care of 9 months? Can we take care of 6 months? There is a number that we can take care of to stimulate that demand. Same way, cut up to say March next year, GST on autos, 6%, 8%. People say we don't have the money. Do we not have the money to cut even by 2%? Now, 2% is not going to make the difference. But what I mean is we have to get to the brass tacks. We have to get to the micro level to say, and I'll come to the fiscal deficit because that's what you were talking about. We have to come to the micro level to say how much can we afford. I think if we get confidence up, if we get the supply side working and bring in some short-term demand stimulus, then the fourth very important pillar, which we also need for the medium and long term, investment will start coming by itself. You don't necessarily need to incentivize investment, because as long as production starts, capacity start getting used, the private sector will come back with investment. So I think these are the four pillars that we need to ride on to rebuild this economy. And where it comes to the fiscal deficit, unlike the US, unlike Britain, unlike Japan, Europe, those are reserve currencies that the world buys and stores. The other countries, nobody buys the Indian rupee. I hope in 10 years' time it becomes so, but nobody buys that today. That creates a limit to how much we can spend. But I would like to see a 3-year roadmap to say that, okay, we are spending more than we can afford to this year. We will spend less next year. And by the third year, because our economy will hopefully grow to a particular level, our fiscal deficit will come down to a manageable count. We should work on this and present this to the rating agencies and say that we need that money today, but this is how we will bring it down. I'm sure they will understand that. I don't know them. I'm not an expert. I'm not an economist. But to me, this is how I would look at it.
Sanjiv, right? Well put. They have put 4 different suggestions altogether. Got deficit and what you're talking about, rating. These are the 2 areas which are very sensitive. I have very strong views on both of them. Because whatever rating agencies are given the ratings to the people, they have collapsed, most of them in the country as well. So rating agencies, how they work, who influences them. As a journalist, I have my own point of view, which we'll discuss later. The question is, when you're talking about so many things there, because when you talk about deficit, you had some reservations about that as well, because there's a limit to that. Question is, you have to spend. There's a question of demand. Unless government is spent or somebody is spent, nobody will get the money in his or her hand. So it's a question whether demand gets first or money goes to them first. That's the economists can decide altogether. Let me go back to supply question you arrived at. There is the Sultan of supply chain sitting here, Dinesh. I'd like to ask him, how much supply chain has been disrupted in the country? and how you want to restore them, what would require, what kind of effort would require, because millions of migrant labor going, who are picking up goods from one place to another, putting into trains, putting the truck, they have moved out of the country. Almost 90 lakh people have moved out of various cities and various manufacturing units. So what kind of challenges do you foresee for restoring the normal supply chain in the country?
Thanks, Mr. Chawla. I think the reality is, I mean, it has been highly disrupted, like you said. I mean, we were operating at about maybe 20% of what we would call as our normal operations. And don't forget that the supply chain, especially of movement of goods as well as warehousing, is a very fragmented business in India. I mean, just to give you an idea, I call that maybe the pure livelihood business. No trucker ever calculates what return he gets on his business. He lives on the business he does. So to be able to restore that back, I think I would go back to what Sanjiv first mentioned, that is to be able to get the confidence back. And I think we are definitely working on that. I would say it is not just the government's job to be able to do that. I think the private sector who are actually utilizing these truckers and the other labor are the ones which we have to also consciously build the confidence of. I think there is a time frame in which this will change. I mean, I agree with Sanjiv that I think the message itself has to change. I mean, if I look at it today and say that, people will kind of, run away from all the major cities because they believe Chennai, Maharashtra, and, Mumbai and Delhi are literally like, places they would like to avoid being considered as, hotspots, even though it may not be real because, all of us living here are not feeling that. But having said that, the reality of it is, if you look at, I would call the current year, I think you will find the supply side will come back pretty fast because it's a question of survival for most of them. So current demand, whatever is available with the demand itself being low, I don't see the supply chain having a big challenge in terms of coming back to normalcy. I would hazard a guess and say it would not take more than 2-3 months. There are 3-4 issues here which we will need to work on. I think one everybody has mentioned, which is the funding side of it. But here also, I think there has to be a slightly smarter way of getting access to some of these smaller players, the funds. I think we in the large corporates have to start working with the banks to work out a methodology by which we can start accessing the smaller players through us rather than ask them to be lent directly, because it's going to be a much bigger challenge. I think we should come back with innovative solutions in terms of being able to reach across to the smaller corporates with some form of a support. I mean, the government guarantee is there, but in terms of the corporate support, in terms of reaching out to them, I think that's number one. Number two is in form of what I would call the feel-good factor, which you mentioned. I think coming from the supply chain side, I think one big reform which I would definitely advocate and I think which we are looking forward to is to have an outsourcing policy. I mean, India can scarcely afford putting in more infrastructure, putting in more or lesser utilization of its current infrastructure. We know whether it is starting from the truck to the port to even, I would say, many of the other places, we do see a significant capacity utilization challenge because we really are not outsourcing as much as the rest of the developed countries do. I mean, just to give you an idea, we are at about 35% outsourcing as compared to, say, US, which is at 80% outsourcing. So I think one of the big reforms, which I think will make a short-term psychological impact, would be to come in with an outsourcing policy, not just for the private sector, but also for the government to follow, which I think could give a quick upswing as far as the supply chain side is concerned. The third element, which I think will also make a big difference, is I would call it as a mix of the MSME focus and the supply chain focus. I think one big factor of the supply chain, which we are not really focused on, is what I call the aftermarket. I mean, if I look at the global aftermarket and just give auto component as an example, we are speaking about close to about $120 billion. If you look at the share which India is having on that, I think it will be less than $1 billion. While on the production side, I think we are a very strong player. So if I look at medium term, I would say the focus on what I would call not just auto, but it could be industrial products, it could be electronics, it could be kickstarting the supply chain for what we call as the post-production phase of any product or of any vehicle is something which I think we in India can aspire for. The MSMEs can actually become a significant player there, and we need to see how we can get that moving. The last element of the supply chain is the retail trade. I mean, we already spoke about it. I mean, whether it is the small guys who are transporting or the small guys who are selling. I mean, again, like I know the auto sector well, so I can give you numbers. We are speaking about 500,000 garages, out of which almost 99% of them would almost go bankrupt within less than 30 to 60 days if they really do not see cash flows coming into them and business kind of picking up. So it's a combination of what Sanjiv said in terms of building the confidence, making sure funding reaches, and I don't think we should just put the blame or the support only from the government side. I think we in the corporate have to start seeing how we can work together to reach out to the smaller guys, to make sure funds are available for them, to support them in any other indirect method. And at the same time, to bring back labor, we have to reach out continuously. I mean, I already see a reversal happening. In fact, I was just told that almost close to about a few hundred laborers who had gone to Bihar are actually returning back to Tamil Nadu as we speak, but they don't want to come to Chennai. They are much happier going to Coimbatore or to Madurai because they believe Chennai is really the hotspot. So I think, let me stop here to say that's the way by which we can actually get the supply chain restarted.
Unless you very well put all the parameters which you thought will revive that supply chain again. But generally what I noticed during this time, because I was also involved in some social work as well, the confidence, the trust. Migrant labor has lost the trust in the owners or proprietors or middlemen which you people have for them. I know a big company, they have building a big complex in Delhi somewhere, 2,600 people working at various sites. And they were not given food for 5 days by the contractor. We had to get the money, and they were trying to get the contractor was supposed to get for the company. And I spoke to the company managing director in Bombay. He said, we are giving everything, but it's not reaching there. This crisis reflected one thing: the labor has lost faith in the contractual system and the big companies. We are poor people, we are left on the road, trains were not available, buses were not available. Because they are basically the key, they are the heart of the supply chain. You don't get labor, you will not be able to move anything from Kashmir to Kanyakumari. That's what is happening. How you are going to restore? Because the exposure of the rich classes, indifferent to the poor classes who are working in the supply chain. How you are going to restore that faith?
So I think maybe let me answer that in a slightly different way. I mean, classical example, like with the supply chain sector as an example. One of the biggest problems we had even during lockdown was that drivers are actually parked vehicles and run away. So when we actually talked to them and said, will you come back? The first question was, how will you be able to take care of us? So we said, A, we will provide you medical insurance so that if you fall sick, we are ready to be able to take care of you. Then we said, we will provide you the PPE. It is additional cost. So, and the last and final thing was, we said that, if you come back, we will give you a special incentive and, we will protect you. Now, you have to walk the talk. I don't think it's an easy thing to restore trust back, especially when you are, as you said, have had issues in terms of doing that. So you have to make sure it becomes visible. You practice it, make them, understood. Communication is not going to happen by talk. I think it has to be walking the talk, which is going to make it. So it will take a few months before you actually see the full benefit of it. But here again, I think the good corporates and even I would say the ones who are committed to the welfare of the people have to take the lead and implement that.
I think one of the major problem is global connectivity of India again, because hospitality industry and every movement of people, everything depends on how India opens to international world again, which is not happening. Most of the countries are flying. But India is the only country where international flying is not allowed. Only Vande Mataram flights are going on. And that must be hotel industry, for example, one of the biggest contributor to Indian exchequer employment in terms of that. So I'll go ask Puneet, what kind of challenges you foresee in the near future? When do you expect hotels to come back in full form as they were earlier?
I think it was interesting listening to all the colleagues. I would just first take a step back and say that there are really three challenges which touch every industry and not just the hotel and the aviation. The first is not the growth, but with how much the growth is going to decline. As Professor Acharya said, is it going to be -7, -10, -15? And what can you do to stop that rapid decline and keep it in sustainable levels? Because the way up is even more difficult. The second part is the rising unemployment, which others have touched upon through various, on various other issues, because hospitality is especially one of the biggest multiplicator of jobs and has been completely neglected. I would say, if neglected is a harsh word, I would say there is less of coherent policy between center and state. What is opening, what is not opening, what will open when, and what kind of norms have to be followed in each of the states. And last not least, I would say, is the immediate need for medical facilities, for which we've been reading in the news that the hotels are being requisitioned under the Disaster Management Act, and we have been helping the governments wherever we have been present since already 2 months. So I think that's not the issue. The main thing is that crises like this are an opportunity to make policy changes which are going to help you get through this 3 months of the phase, as Shobhana ji said, of survival, we call it, and then help you somehow revive the economy in the following 3 months. And that's when I think the revival will start. As of September, October, November, it's anybody's guess, depending on what happens in the next few months. But it'll definitely happen within the revival phase will start. And if you have to be talking about a self-reliant and Atmanirbhar, I think that's definitely deferred to next year. But the policies can be made now to help the country get there. And there is no harm in learning from many other countries where it has happened. So having lived like maybe 30 years in Europe, and of which maybe 15 in Germany, I always like to take the German example. There are 2 phases of Germany which are very fascinating. One of that is the so-called Wirtschaftswunder, the economic wonder of the 60s and the early 70s. And the latest one was when the reunification of Germany happened, when the West had to absorb the East. And a lot of policies were put in where cash followed. And actually, if you go and visit the Eastern German part today, it looks far more advanced than the Western part because everything was built from scratch. So when it comes to hospitality sector, and I think I have to appreciate that both Shobhana and Naushad have been like kind of batting for us. So that was very nice. Not heard many people outside the industry talking positive or that something should be done for the industry. So that was good. I think we have to go from being dependent to independent. We're too much dependent on certain ways of doing business. And I think, as Shobhana mentioned, we could go in for public-private partnerships, get more MSMEs involved to kind of spur the growth that is needed. From being very complex, that would be my number 2 point, to be more compliant. Today, to open a hotel, I was told we need maybe 70, 80 different kind of licenses. Maybe as an example, you could do it 10 and you are still compliant, but you don't have to go from one office to the other to get the license. The third is from being very enduring to be, a kind of an enabling policy, which means investment in our infrastructure, which we had started. I think it should continue because having good airports, having connectivity in secondary cities and primary cities makes a nation more agile. And if you get the agility, you get the Atmanirbharta too. The fourth one, I think, was mentioned by, I think Sanjiv mentioned that on GST rates, I would call it, rationing to rationalization. So hospitality and aviation is still considered a very bit, it's a luxury sector. These guys, they're always in a suit and a tie like I am now, and they're always in air-conditioned, spaces and having a good time. We are there for the guests. That's the kind of business we are in. And I think we made a correction on the GST from 28% to bring it down to a big amount. But I think there is a long way to go because it's a part of building the infrastructure of a country which provides directly, indirectly, in organized sector, more than 12.5% of the jobs and almost 9% contribution to GDP. That's where it was with a big way to go. Then I would say, fourthly, it's going from a very localized approach to a little bit global before we start thinking global. I think even if we get the leadership in the midterm, in our regional areas, that would be good to target at one part of the world, but not be all over the place, because that would maybe be a much more difficult exercise instead of being a leader in the region. And last not least, as the Prime Minister said, I would not say discover India, but rediscover your own India. And all this could be done. To come back to what Professor Acharya had said, you don't need cash for it. You could incentivize travel next year, because domestic tourism is the one that is going to lead charge in reviving the demand in the next 12 to 18 months, not just in India, but in every country of the globe, because the international travel will be for some time subdued. And then you have the weather challenges. In some times of the years, people like to come, and in the other times, there are no conferences, there are no such business meetings, and people don't come. So I think by doing a few of these things, and there must be 5, 10 more, I tried to simplify it, that the hospitality sector can be revived. And one of my favorites, which I've been saying to everyone, is after independence, after 7 decades of independence, it is time that this sector was given the status of infrastructure by the center and of that of industry by the states, so that it can also get the same privileges like any other industry or any other sector gets, because it's the most capital intensive, but it's also the most labor intensive. And labor intensive again keeps coming back to unemployment or employability. And if more people are employed, there is more disposable income, there is more income in the economy, and there is less social inequalities. And it helps to build what you call a nice social market economy, which can thrive over the next decades.
Nicely put, Puneet. Very interesting. All that you are very clear in your what you want to be done. And let me go back, because I just in the beginning you said we don't know what is going to happen in terms of growth, whether it will be -5%, 10%, 20%. I'll go back to now Kiran, because she's very vocal in these subjects. And 1 year ago, she spoke somewhere, if I am right, please correct me if I'm wrong, that you said somewhere that GDP growth, if it is 5%, we should declare emergency. Now it is going to be less than -5%. What do you call now?
So, Prabhuji, I just want to start by saying that, look, these are all numbers and percentages which we really shouldn't worry about at this stage. I think what we really need to do is to reset our growth targets. You know, we wanted to become a $5 trillion economy. And I think that is really the target we need to set ourselves with. When are we going to become a $5 trillion economy? Do we have to shift it by a year or 2 or 3? I think that is what we really need to look at this stage. Now, I think one very important thing that this crisis has actually shown us is that we are very resourceful as a country. At least our sector, the health science, healthcare sector, has actually risen to the challenge. We have seen a lot of unleashing of innovation coming out of the biotech and pharma sector. And I think we must also remember that this is a sector that employs almost 10 million people. You know, if you look at the fact that we employ about close to 3 million nurses, an equal number of ASHA and Anganwadi workers, 1 million plus doctors, and then of course a large number in the industry itself. So I think the Prime Minister rightly said that he wants to double the spend on healthcare, because this particular pandemic actually brought the whole world to understand that we were underinvested in public health and primary healthcare and healthcare in general. India is the most underinvested, and therefore I think doubling this healthcare spend and also doubling our investment in research and innovation from less than 1% to at least 2% will actually enable us to create a pretty large sector. Today, I think in terms of jobs and in terms of economic opportunity, health science and healthcare has a huge opportunity for driving economic growth. Now, if you think about it, this is one sector that cuts from grassroots to very specialized professional skills. from startups to small SMEs to large industry. So it is a very, very good ecosystem to support. And I have made a case saying that we can make this into the next big IT for India. Okay? Because if you look at it, today we actually supply almost 75% of the WHO's vaccine requirements. Okay? We actually cater to almost 50% of generic drugs in the world. So we already have very, very strong fundamentals with which to grow this sector. But like I think everybody has mentioned on this is a capital intensive sector when it comes to investment. So the intent is there, the investment needs are very high. And if you want people to invest in this sector, which they will, because now the world needs more vaccines, the world needs more drugs, and this is our opportunity to actually quickly build this sector by simply scaling up what we have created. But for that, the investment needs have to be looked at in a very different way. We need to be given the kind of incentives the IT sector got. And you see what that did to the IT sector today for India. I think the same can be achieved for the health science, healthcare sector for India. And this whole thing is about self-reliance, Atmanirbhar Bharat. It fits into everything. The Make in India, for the world, everything. It has got all the makings of what we want to see in terms of economic revival and economic growth. So I, for one, really believe that we need to look at some of these sectors which are low-hanging fruits. Others have challenges like, Puneet has mentioned. But I agree with Puneet that I think we need to look at every one of these challenge sectors in a very different way, because every sector can be incentivized. And I just want to make one comment, and that is that we need to remove the fear psychosis out of this pandemic. We need to revive the economy in a fearless way. Because if you actually look at the numbers, I don't say that the infection rates are going to remain at where they are. I think the infection rates will surge. But what we really need to look at is the mortality rates. The mortality rates are very low. They are much lower than many other infectious diseases that India is faced with. Okay? So how do we remove this fear psychosis is really the big challenge we have. And good understanding of how to deal with the disease is extremely important. And I think Shobna referred to it. I think in the early stages, I think we did realize that this disease had taken us by surprise. We didn't know how to deal with the disease. We didn't know how to treat the disease. But today, after a few months, we have understood how to deal with the disease. We have understood how to treat the disease. And I think we will be able to keep the mortality rate very, very low. So as soon as people know that this is not a disease they need to be scared of, I think you can get back economic activity. And that's what I'm pitching for. The vaccine is going to take some time. You might get a semblance of a vaccine in the next few months or by the end of the year, but that's not going to be a vaccine that really gives you the kind of protection and safety that you're looking for, because that's going to take some time before you know whether this vaccine is really protecting you and for how long. So I would not worry so much about the vaccine. I would more worry about how we are managing the disease. And if we are managing it well, and I think there are lots of things that we as a country should actually, that's another part of Atmanirbhar that we should focus on. Because I think we also need to have self-belief. Self-reliance requires self-belief. We cannot keep on waiting for the outside world to tell us what to do. We need to be self-reliant in terms of how to manage this disease. We need to be self-reliant in terms of how we want economic activity to be pursued in this country. So everything is about self-reliance, and that self-reliance actually calls for self-belief. We need to have more faith and belief that our treatment regimens are working. We need to have much more belief that our drugs and our medicines are working. And we need to have much more confidence and belief that we know what we are doing and our healthcare ecosystem is managing the disease well. Right now, we are looking at a lot of comments and criticism from everywhere else in the world. And that is not also a good thing, because we don't understand what's happening with us. And we are much more, on top of things than we realize. Yes, the numbers are rising, but that should not really be of surprise to us, because this is a viral infection. And yes, we have learned how to contain it, how to track it, how to trace it. So we should do it even better. And I also believe that, we as a country ought to be investing much more in medical research than we have done all this time, because we have the capabilities. We must stop the brain drain that is happening today. We are graduating so many, doctors and specialist doctors. Most of them prefer to go overseas because the research environment here is not so exciting. Look at the treasure trove of research substrate that we have here. We have IT that can do us data analytics. We've got all the kind of diseases that we can do research on. So I, for one, am very optimistic that this particular crisis actually throws up many, many opportunities for us. And I, for one, believe that we should not fear the disease. If you look at the mortality rate, it's amongst the lowest in the world. It's below 3% on current data. And if you look at it at a population scale, it's minuscule. As long as we keep the mortality rates down, I would not really fear this disease. And that's what the strong message I want to give for economic revival. And I really hope that we can actually come out of this stronger. I think just like we've had the lockdown that has helped us to prepare to unlock and get economic activity back, I think this phase of economic decline should also be treated like a kind of a lockdown, which should allow us to see how we want to rebuild the economy. One of the big opportunities I think we have is in regulatory reforms. I think many of you have spoken about regulatory reforms. I think Puneet said that he needed 100 regulatory approvals and it could be brought down to 10. But I'm saying let's even go beyond that. We've actually, one important thing of this pandemic is that it created digital platforms. And if you can leverage a digital online platform for regulatory processes, you can parallel process, you can create virtual single windows, and you can significantly bring down regulatory timelines, which again will help our economy. So I think a lot is possible, and I think we should look at it as an opportunity. So I'll stop here.
You have given a lot of prescription for how to get out of it. For one thing very important, you're talking about self-reliant means self-relief. That is what Atmanirbhar means. Modi, when he speaks that, okay, we should be Atmanirbhar, that we should have a trust in ourselves. But still, as a journalist, I can't get back without my question being answered, which I raised in the beginning. I am repeating again, because that's the description I want. You told us in 2019 that 5% growth is like an economic emergency. So minus 5% now, how would you define it now? Because it's staring at you at the moment.
Well, I think, if to me 5% was a economic emergency, I can't say that minus 5% is anything, but this is something that has happened out of a crisis. So when the whole world is challenged with this crisis, I would not even bother to describe it as anything, because we are all sunk, so to speak. And I think we need to come out of this. So that's the way I would look at it. I really would not even bother to describe a minus 5% growth, because I would rather focus on how do we get out of this and come out stronger.
On a lighter vein, just like a joke I'm cracking here, because Mrs. Gandhi, I'm reminded of Mrs. Gandhi when something used to happen bad in India, she would say it's a global phenomenon. Now, of course, the economic crisis here is a global phenomenon at the moment. Let me go back to basic question now, because everybody has spoken about what is expected to be done. Everybody has given the, but I would go back to everything depends on how demand in this country is created. I think all of you have spoken about demand, but none of you have given specific measures or effective action on the part of each one of you or government, which can spur demand. I'm raising a very fundamental question. Dr. Acharya, I would request him to explain first, because my belief is an economist by education and journalist by profession, that the model which we have been following since 1991, when we used to call in journalism language, the nomination of Singh Darbar in economic policy, Manmohan Singh, Montek Singh, and N.K. Singh, they created a supply phenomena in this country. And in 2020, we are not talking about supply. When 57% of GDP comes from the sector which employs less than 15% of the working force, when 17% of the 15% of GDP comes from 50% of the rural economy, where 50% people are, how you will create a demand? Because economic inequality which has happened during the last 25 years, 30 years, don't you think the sins of the past are catching it with us, Dr. Acharya? The policies which were created for supply, you are not able to meet with the demand because the demand is not growing proportionally.
Prabhu, I'm not entirely sure what you're asking here, but if you're...
Let me repeat then. Let me repeat.
Say that. Okay.
Yeah. I say after 30 years, we find 57% of the GDP is produced by a sector which employs less than 15% of labor force. And 50% of the labor force still depends on the sector, agriculture, which gives only 15% of the GDP. So how is it when the 50% people doesn't have enough money to create a demand, you create a supply through a services sector, so how you create a demand now, the model which you followed, supply side model, that is a food supply necessarily doesn't create its own demand. Am I clear now?
I think I get a better idea of what you're saying. First of all, of course, I have to say that I don't agree with your characterization of the last 30 years are a supply side model. As an economist, supply and demand go together, and sometimes you have to put one first, and sometimes you have to put the other one first. But basically, you can't have a supply without demand, and you can't have demand without supply. So I just want to, we can take the debate offline on that one. But I think the broad issue that you're raising, if I understand right, is that, look, agriculture produces 15% of GDP, and yet employment there, at the same time, it employs something like close to half the labor force.
Yes.
So you have a huge problem. Now, I completely agree with you that has been a big failure of Indian development strategy for many years. It's not just from 90 onwards, it goes back to 1947 onwards. And the failure there is, unlike other developing countries, particularly in East Asia, where you had very fast and sustainable rapid growth in the manufacturing sector, not just growth, but employment intensive growth, you essentially moved a large proportion of your labor force out of low productivity agriculture into much higher productivity manufacturing and also services, of course. Now, this goes back to what you said right in your opening remarks. We seem to have, to some extent, skipped manufacturing. I totally agree that's a big problem in India, has been a big problem, and we have to try and, in the future, make it less of a problem. So I don't think it's Manmohan Singh and company, what they did or didn't do kind of issue. It's a much longer problem. And there, in a way, what has happened has made it a bigger challenge. Because if you notice one thing, what do we know about the data in the last 3 months after the pandemic, and in particular the lockdown, which was a response to the pandemic? What do we see? So far, we don't really have official data on what's happened to national output. People are saying all sorts of things, including me, but we don't have official data. What data we do have suggests, as you and others have said, that GDP might have dropped something like, 10, 15, 20% in the first quarter. But we know right from the beginning that employment, because there we do have the CMI data, dropped by about 30%. The positive side of this is, I think, that the kind of employment loss that we saw, which was very tragic and terrible, and there are a lot of people to blame for it, and enough blame to spread around. But the positive thing, I think, is, as several people here have today mentioned, that a lot of this employment can be wooed back over the next few months with some sensible policies at the level of industry and service sector. That, after all, where have they gone? We hear that a significant portion of it has migrated back to the poorer states, whether it's Bihar or UP or Bengal or Orissa, whatever. Now, those are very labor surplus situations anyway. And so there really no long-term future, sustainable future for them and their families. So that should be possible to get them back with a minimum of what Kiranji said about getting rid of the fear factor and getting away from that, and providing some basic insurance capacities either at the enterprise level or with some support from government. And that's the only way I think that is feasible. I think getting a lot of manufacturing or modern manufacturing or modern services activity into whether it's rural Bihar or rural UP, I don't see that as a very strong, viable proposition for the future. It's much easier, I think, in my view, to try and get back to some semblance of where we were, but that wasn't good enough, let's be clear, and then work to make it much, much better in the future.
I'll come back to you because Kiran spoke about the health sector and whatnot. What is coming out these days during the pandemic is that healthcare is out of reach of the common man. That it's very capital expensive, intensive, and you have to invest a lot of money. And you have been in this business for many years. Why Indian ordinary person can't afford a good health care in the country even after 75 years? What is the root cause and how to make it affordable health care in the country?
May I answer that on Shobhana's behalf?
Yeah, please.
I'd just like to say that we actually have a very affordable healthcare model. When you compare it globally, I think we do have a very affordable healthcare model. I think what has happened is that we haven't been able to, create a public-private partnership model where the private sector is able to sustain on what the government believes is the right price point. I think the government's way of calculating packages is not viable for private sector, because the way we are looking at the way these packages are coming out is based on just cost, basic cost. I don't think any of the government packages factors in operating costs, the investment costs. These are very expensive, capital intensive investments that the private hospitals make. And I think we must understand that if we want these hospitals to be more affordable, then they need to be given subsidies and stimulus packages that bring down the capex costs, the interest costs, and what have you. So it's not fair to judge private sector operating costs with government sector operating costs, because it's not comparing apples for apples. And that is where I think the biggest problem is. And we need to make sure that there is a very rational discussion and dialogue to bring about a level playing field that makes people realize that this is what we are talking about.
So I'll emphasize the demand part more now, because there is a consensus in the country that demand has to be created. And for that, what I say, you need the vitamin M, money. Sanjiv, I would like to ask you, what could be the factor, what could be the suggestion on your part to revive that demand at the bottom level? It has to be bottom-up approach. I think top-down approach has gone out. And as Shankaracharya, one of his book, wrote, that can India grow without Bharat? And he will explain to what does it mean Bharat and what does it mean by India. But I'm asking you, Sanjiv, what do you think should be done to revive demand? Because if the demand is, unless you revive the demand, you can't consume the supply which you are going to create. There must be surpluses also.
Prabhuji, I mentioned actually a few points in
earlier
my comments on demand. So let me just repeat them. But let me go to another point of yours, if you allow me, which you asked Mr. Acharya as well. This country grew at 9% 10 years ago, with even more people from rural India involved in agriculture. So with the right things, we can go back to 9% growth. So let's not try to overcomplicate the situation. On top of that, in the last 10 years, your typical agricultural population beyond agriculture is also involved in a lot of rural infrastructure projects. The entire Manrega scheme of the government has put significant amount of money into rural India over the past decade. When you add on top of this 1 billion accounts, online bank accounts, and other, we are creating a very strong system of direct subsidies that can go to rural India, electronic KYC, which is what banks, anybody lending, insurance needs. And that way, demand can grow. Now, I'll give you an example of our own finance company, Bajaj Finance. We are present in 2,500 cities, towns, rural India. 35% of our business comes from rural India. They may not buy a 42-inch TV, they'll buy a 36-inch TV. They may not buy a double-door refrigerator, they'll buy a single-door refrigerator. They'll buy a smartphone for 15,000 rupees. And their credit is better than urban India. So rural India is also growing. It has a smaller size, smaller pocket. It will happen over a period of time. But with the right measures, you will be able to see that change. Coming back now on the demand stimulus, my sense is that a short-term demand stimulus is required at this point of time. It's like, another analogy is if there is a patient in the emergency room of a hospital that has just come from a major traumatic, let's say from a heart attack, the doctors for a few days will give a cocktail of medications to revive the patient. The same medication, if you give for weeks and months, can kill the patient. So in the short term, to get things to move, you need a boost of something different, which is what our short-term demand stimulus should do to take our economy out of its comatose state. And I think where it can help the most in the most quickest form is on individual consumption. And I mentioned two large asset classes, home and two-wheeler and four-wheeler. Incentivize this for the short term, and you will kickstart demand. But as I mentioned earlier also, before doing that, rebuild confidence, remove that fear. And we have to all do it. It is not only the government's job. We have to all do it with our own employees, with our colleagues, with our families. Stay safe, practice safety, but remove fear and create that short-term stimulus.
Rajiv, Sanjiv, you're absolutely right. What you spoke about 9% growth. I don't want to get into that discussion because I'm a student of economics as well. Because from 91 to 2020, inequalities of income in this country has gone up. How much by what has happened? In the Prime Minister spoke, even after 70 years, how many people pay income tax of more than 10 lakh rupees of income? And last data was 2 years ago that 1% of the top people got 69% of income generated in last year. That is also one reason, because the demand is concentrated in the hands of people. I'm not against this. People have to make wealth because they're spending money, they make money. The question is equitable distribution of income would have created much more stable, sustainable demand model, which is my feeling that would have sustained the thing happened. Now let me go back to Naushad, because he was speaking about these things. It was very specific, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5.
But Prabhuji, before you do that, if you allow me to interrupt, I'm not an economist. Please. I'm not an economist. Let's keep in mind, countries' growth, one has to see over decades, one has to see over centuries. There can be periods of time when there is income inequality. But the more important thing is, if at every income segment, people are doing better than what they did 10, 20 years ago, then we are in the right direction. I'll stop.
No, I will not get into debate, because there's one of the columns which I wrote a letter to the Prime Minister that India needs more lakhpatis, not crorpatis. And we are turning to making crorpatis into arabpatis, and lakhpatis are becoming poorer. That is a different issue altogether. We will not get into that debate. But let me go back to Naushad, because he was very specific in that term. That let us list down, because you're all against deficit financing by thinking, by conviction. And if you are against deficit financing, what America does, you have a different reason altogether. If the capital gains tax are not imposed, you get gains. Because of that, you make more money. Yes, you invested in, you work hard. I am not, that work hard should not be paid. But we are perhaps the only country which has over 30 years, almost 25 years, no capital gains tax on the stock market. And that may have led to inequalities of income as well. There are many owners who have a cash reserve in their own personal pocket of over 1 lakh crore rupees, but they don't pay enough income tax. But that is the policy. I don't want to get into that. But I want Naushad to tell us very specifically, because you spoke about cash transfer in the hands of people. But how it can be done without deficit? Why can't government issue bonds or capitalize deficit? And Mr. Acharya can tell you more later. But I want to ask you, Because you spoke about cash transfer.
That of how one can do it without increasing the deficit? I have no idea. I don't think you can. I think if you're actually going to spend, if the government is going to actually spend more, yes, you will increase spending. If you increase spending, the only argument, by the way, is that if you didn't have that spending from the government, your tax collections and your overall economic activity would be so much lower that you will actually end up with a bigger deficit. That's the argument in favor of actually of a stimulus. That's the argument in favor of spurring demand. I want to come to your question on spurring demand. Yeah, there are two other areas that are big opportunities that are available apart from what Sanjiv mentioned about immediate things that would spur demand. There are two other areas. One, the government should pay its bills. There are huge outstandings from the government to the private sector and to public sector undertakings. Probably around 3 lakh crores, yes. Right? That's, if the government pays its bills, that in itself will be a huge cash stimulus into the economy. Will it add to the deficit? Yes, in the short run, because of the cash accounting system that we follow in the government. Yes. But it's the sensible thing to do because it's one time, it will be a stimulus. Second, right, a huge public works program and infrastructure investments from the government. We have many issues that we need to address, whether these issues relate to transport and transport infrastructure, whether they relate to infrastructure within our cities, to address housing, many opportunities that we have, which can actually end up employing people in a massive way and can actually end up also addressing the issue that you raised about equality. Because,
we've got very little time left now. Let me go back to Dinesh again, because demand is also related to restoring the supply chain, because maximum labor is involved in that. What do you think? How the demand can be revived? I want 2-3 suggestions short because we are going to conclude.
No, I think obviously, money is something which everybody can speak about. But I think the real change is going to come at the rural level. I think the biggest benefit which I think we can do is to make sure the supply chain is available where there is some demand which could be generated. I think right now we are speaking about a fairly good harvest which people had last year and going forward even this year. I'll just give you one example of that. We saw tractor demand and spare parts demand for tractors actually come back to 70% of the normal in May. So there are going to be a few sectors which I think you are going to see significant increase in demand. And I think we need to use the confidence booster of those sectors to have a direct rub-off on others. And I think there are two aspects to it. One is, as I said, the money side, which I think everybody has spoken of, so I won't mention. The second is that message to be actually understood and tom-tom so that the feel-good factor comes in. The second is for the large corporates, and I will repeat this, that for the large corporates to take the responsibility of working with the MSMEs and the retailers and the smaller people with whom they are under their fold, to make sure that they start feeling the confidence that they will survive this crisis. And either not providing money directly, but through the government support and through the banks. These for me are the two big ticket ones which we can do to make a quick change.
Puneet, I'll come back to you because you are in a sector where demand is more important and it has some kind of a cumulative effect on the economy. What do you suggest? Be brief on that.
I think just repeating what Kiran and Sanjiv, everyone said, over here, kickstart economic activity. And finally, then it comes to the hospitality, tourism and travel sector. Communicate. When you travel, you are staying safe with us.
Now I'll round up in a way because I'm going to ask a very blunt question to all of you. You have to say yes or no, or you can not say if this and that, but that, because that is what for spurring demand, my feeling is government should forget about the deficit. It should go across the deficit, yes or no, 5% and above. Mr. Shankaracharya.
It should never forget about its deficit, but that doesn't mean it shouldn't have one.
It is not sacred anymore. 3.5% can cross. You think government should cross for revival?
Listen, I will take one half a minute to say that I expect this year the central government's deficit will be north of 6% of GDP, The states will be another 4 to 5. You'll get a general government deficit of about 12% anyway. So if you think...
You are saying should be, but is it desirable?
No, I'm saying it's already on that track, and it will be. I'll bet you anything. You want to take a bet? I'll take it right now.
No, I agree with you what you're saying. I'm just saying whether you, for a pandemic cure, you suggest that deficit, the line which you had fixed economy, the 3.5% is an ideal for us. They should ignore that.
No, in a pandemic situation, obviously you have to change your view. But all I'm saying is that if one thinks that a deficit at a level of GDP is unlimited and riskless, I think that's completely wrong.
And second,
because, your debt to GDP ratio is going to be very high, and you will have a loss of confidence all across, internationally as well as domestically.
I'll add another small question, yes or no again. Should India ignore rating agencies altogether? Moody's against Moody's mission. So they should ignore this?
That's their business.
No, what do you think? Moody's ratings, because look at the ILFS and other companies which have collapsed after the high ratings.
Moody's have already changed their rating. So they've
brought it down, no? I'm just saying for deficit financing, country rating is also on the deficit financing. No, and that you have.
No, but it's not only at the level. I mean, Moody's,
many of the factors are there. Yes.
In fairness to Moody's, they gave reasons that they felt that it's not just about the deficit. They felt that the way things were going, the growth of this economy was going to be low in the medium term. Now, you may disagree, but that's what it's their prerogative to take a view.
Sanjiv, you tell me, does deficit financing, any limit should be fixed during this time or not?
Yes, to the way Mr. Acharya explained it, 11-12%, maybe you can do another 1.5%, but it can't be unlimited. We cannot ignore Modi or anybody else, but it doesn't mean that we are blindly supporting what they do. In any orchestra, every person has to play their instrument well.
Yeah, Mr. Dinesh.
No, I think I agree with Sanjiv. I think I would definitely say we can exceed by maybe 1 or 2%, but we cannot ignore that, and we cannot afford to the rating agencies to further downgrade you, because ultimately, let us say, investment in India takes place on that basis.
But they don't apply the same principle on Western countries, no? Which they apply on us.
I agree. That's a different point.
Yeah, Naushad, tell me. Rating agency, India should follow rating agency, but West can ignore them.
Exactly as Sanjiv said on the deficit. On the rating agencies, we shouldn't do anything because of the rating. We should worry about doing the right thing. The rating should be an outcome.
Good. Yeah, thank you. Now, what about Puneet?
I think if we had thought only of rating, then we would be in a bigger trouble. So
we should ignore that.
A good way.
Thank you very much, all of you. It was a very lively discussion, of course. All of you suggested very well. All of you emphasized the need for a demand spur in this country, and supply model is, of course, is there. But most of you still believe that what has been done, more can be done to boost the economy. It's a question of survival at the moment. If you survive, only then you can thrive in this country. Thank you very much for having an event. Thank you very much.